War inevitably creates displaced people, refugees, innocent civilians whose lives are turned inside out. As Poland receives millions of Ukrainians fleeing Russia's missiles, novelist Eva Stachniak recalled her own mother's words about how war leaves lasting effects on families. She wrote about that for TVO.org. Eva Stachniak's latest work of historical fiction is The School of Mirrors, and she joins us now from Ontario's capital city. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So in your article for TVO.org, you write, "War lingers in families. It is visible in generations of silent men drinking far too much, in women with empty eyes who refuse to talk of the past." What did you mean by that?
Well, I grew up on the ruins of the war. I grew up watching piles of rubble. And no matter what you tell a child who looks at the pile of rubble around you, where you can still see bits and pieces of the old apartments, and then, of course, just mountains of these rubbles around me, nothing can reassure you that you are safe. The only safe thing is the love of your family and of your parents. So I was really always aware of the fact that I grew up on the ruins of the terrible war, and that I will have to understand how to live and how to keep hope and how to survive if that war comes back. You know, I was always terribly aware of the fact that my grandmother lived through 2 world wars. My mother lived through 1 World War and Nazi occupation and then Stalinist period. And that if I want to be a mother, I will probably have to live through 1 war. And if I want to be a grandmother, then probably 2. So I think that sense a lot of people from Poland and Ukraine and Russia grew up with.
Now, you spent most of your life in Wrocław, Poland. I want to show two photos of you. The first is of you as a child with your mother. This was taken in 1954. And then another photo, this was 2 years later in 1956, with you posing, pushing a carriage. What was it like? Describe to me what it was like growing up in a city that you describe a city of refugees.
Poland, Wrocław was very interesting in that sense because everybody around me was displaced, including my own family. This was the city from which the German population left in 1945, basically fleeing the Red Army. And it is the city into which refugees from former Ukraine and former Soviet Union, central Poland, bombed out cities came. So everyone around me always had a picture, an image of this other home that they have left, including my grandparents. And so you always have a sense of being in the city, living, and also living with the memories of your family that your family has for you, of that other idealized place. So, so that was the reality. On the other hand, there was a sense of that Wrocław was really not fully Polish, that it was still Breslau, the German city, and that therefore we can be asked to move at any time, or we may be forced to move at any time. So I always had a sense of always being very close to displacement. And when I came to Canada, I realized that being an immigrant is really not very different. I've been an immigrant and a refugee in a sense, or among refugees all my life.
I want to actually talk about your chapter here in Canada. We have a photo of you in Montreal. This is back in 1981. What happened after you got here?
Well, I have to say that I came to Montreal, to McGill, to study at McGill in the English department. And in fact, I also came at the time, sort of 3 months before the martial law was declared in Poland. And that really changed my life because from a foreign student, I became a refugee. I became someone who did not want to go back to Poland because it had tanks in the street, it had martial law, the solidarity was crushed. And there was this sense of heaviness and foreboding of what might happen. we were all expecting a Soviet invasion. It was very, very realistic that we would end up in the place that Ukraine is now. So that also lay very heavily. But at the same time, Canada was just wonderful, wonderful. And well, you know, that sense of opening, of welcoming the Polish people who were sort of stuck in Canada, extending all sorts of possibilities, legal and just you know, friendly hands, friendly people who would invite me and my family and take care of us in so many ways. So I never forgot it. I think that it was a coming home in some ways, you know, because Canada became home during that first year, when I knew I didn't want and couldn't really return to Poland.
I want to show another photo. This is a photo of a tank in Warsaw, same time in 1981, that same year from the previous photo, Poland's capital here. You were separated from your family. You were in Montreal, but the rest of your family were in Poland. How difficult was that?
It was very difficult. It was my son, who was 3.5 at the time when I left, and he and my husband were supposed to come and join me in Montreal. So the martial law meant that they were not able to join me right away. They eventually, luckily, were, but. That particular picture that you showed was what I found on the morning of the 14th of December. That was a picture taken in Warsaw. And I think that, you know, the cinema is called Moscow cinema. The tank in the street suggests, you know, that there is a war, yet another war, that war that I feared as a child that I would have to live through if I wanted to be a mother. And the sense that my family is there, and I didn't really know what it meant. I didn't know whether the government was still ready to let people leave. They finally did, so that wasn't such a big problem. But I wasn't sure of that. I didn't know whether I would have to just pack and go back, or if they would be allowed to leave. So very, very, very difficult time. And you know, it's something that I see with every wave of refugees. You have stories of people separated and not knowing whether they would ever see the loved ones, or if not the immediate family, then parents, grandparents. That was a very, very difficult situation.
In your article for tvo.org, you make the connection to that time to what's happening right now in Ukraine. How does that situation back then play into what's happening there?
The moment I saw the refugees at the Polish border, Ukrainian refugees, mostly women and children, it was like having this powerful reminder of 1981 for me, and also that sense of, I know what they feel. I know the children who are clinging to their parents or to their mothers. I know that they have seen already too much, something that I hope no other generation of children will ever have to. But of course, these are just hopes, because the world has been engulfed in so many conflicts ever since. So my connection to it, to my own memories, and to how I felt then, and how I know these people feel, and also joy that Poland did what Canada did when I came here, that Poland actually opened up its arms and welcomed the women and the children who were fleeing the war, and that they are living to their promise to help them and to shelter them until the situation is resolved. And the sense of that they are living through what we were saved from in 81. There was no Soviet invasion, luckily. I mean, there was the martial law, and there were the long years of resistance. And that, I think, Ukraine is also will have to face, you know, if the rebuilding, the resistance, the sense of trying not to be weighed down with the heaviness of these losses. So a lot of very personal memories ever since I saw these first pictures.
On that point, how much of your personal experiences inform your works of historical fiction?
I think it's all about that. I mean, I always write about people who are leaving one culture and joining another. I write about how big history affects everyday life. The French Revolution in the School of Mirrors, the fighting in the streets, the great social changes. Yes, they play out in the politics, but they really play out in the families, because the families bear the brunt and the trauma of war. And that trauma lives through generations. So I write about that. I write about people who have to pick up their lives and find something that will give them hope, and how, and not only them, but their children, because you have to raise children with hope and with understanding that there is strength in resistance. There is strength in picking up and leaving and joining another culture, living in another culture. There is strength that is contagious. In a sense, it also, I'm trying to write about how it plays through generations, with generations, and with different lives. The Chosen Maiden, in my novel about Brania Nijinsky, in fact, with this book, I spent I spent, in a sense, 1 year with her in Kiev right after the revolution. So my books take me to the very places that I came from. And they help me with my thoughts, and it helped me pass on my experience to Canadian readers and readers in other countries who read my books.
Beautifully said. Eva, thank you so much for sharing your personal story with us, and thank you for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.